I think nobody will be surprised if I say that immigration is one of the most important issues in international politics, and certainly both in Europe and in the United States. Lately, everything related to this issue takes over most of the news and the front pages of the newspapers.
Immigration is the fault in all of the problems that we're having.
What the administration has decided to do is to separate children from their parents, to try to send a message that if you cross the border with children, your children are going to be ripped away from you. That's traumatizing to the children who are innocent victims, and it is contrary to our values in this country.
The United States will not be a migrant camp, and it will not be a refugee holding facility. Won't be.
Desde el Gobierno de España vamos a hacer todo lo posible por dar una respuesta global europea a un fenómeno que es global como es el de las migraciones.
Dos países hermanos como Colombia y Venezuela no pueden entrar en esa dinámica de persecución al migrante, no pueden transitar ese camino de xenofobia y de odio que sufren otras regiones del mundo. No lo podemos permitir.
Without going any further here at VisualPolitik, we've already spoken a few times about this subject, and soon we're going to post a special video, first on our Patreon and then here on YouTube, commenting and dismantling many of the myths and half-truths that exist on this subject. And just before we get into the meat of today's video, speaking of Patreon, let me thank everyone who is supporting us on Patreon and everyone who just watches us. We're about to cross the 500,000 subscriber mark, so that's pretty amazing, and we couldn't do that without you, especially the people who do support us, like I say, on Patreon. Because of that, we are now publishing 50% more videos, and we're now preparing lots of surprises and, of course, all of the other things that we have promised you. But for now, let's just crack on.
We are people! We are not illegal!
We are the dreamers of USA!
Dear viewer, this time I'd like to share some reflections with you, some ideas which I think we should keep in mind when we're talking about immigration. This is particularly important if we consider that lately mistrust, fear, and anti-immigration political speeches, well, they're very much alive.
Get out of my country. I can still hear that sentence with absolute clarity, as if it occupies a specific place in my mind. It's a scar. Deep within, the man who said, "Get out of my country," was a Trump supporter. I know this because he was wearing a pin identifying the then candidate on one of his lapels. But most of all, I know this because of the way he said it to me. He looked me straight in the eyes, pointed a finger at me, and shouted. Jorge Ramos, a journalist from Univision and a U.S. citizen who was born in Mexico.
One of the most typical and popular arguments of those who oppose immigration is stating that immigrants take our jobs and take the money back to their own countries. You know, as long as we're not talking about Messi, Cristiano Ronaldo, Nadal, or maybe the Rolling Stones. There, of course, there's no problem, which is perhaps a bit hypocritical, don't you think? So now we come to the question, well, why do people decide to emigrate? Who are these people who pack their bags and leave their land? Who benefits from all of this movement? And in general, why is there such a negative perception of this phenomenon? Well, in this video, I'm going to try and answer some of those questions, but first, I think it's time we took a look back at how it all began. When, why, and where. By the way, what would you say if I told you that in some way you're also an immigrant? Well, listen up.
The origin.
From the very beginnings of humanity, people moved. Basically, their motivation was to find food, which forced them to move continuously from one place to another. Of course, back then, borders didn't exist. The only limitation to moving from one place to another was how far one could travel. But of course, all this began to change when modern societies emerged. That is when communities settled in a particular place where they worked to produce food, tools, and everything they needed to trade and to live. Now, one thing we can ask ourselves here is, did the migration phenomenon disappear with this new way of life? Well, no, not at all. See, once the first modern societies established themselves in certain places and governments began to emerge back around 3000 BC, migration didn't stop, although motivations did change. Two large migration groups were created, so to speak, two groups with really different motivations. On the one hand, there was conquering, and on the other hand, there was searching for opportunities. The first, conquests, were movements carried out by societies that had achieved a higher level of development and who wanted to take advantage of it to gain wealth from the people they conquered. This involved a migratory movement from the most developed countries to the less developed countries to monopolize their resources. Although this phenomenon wasn't exclusive to any continent, the case that we all know best is perhaps that of the Europeans who managed to control almost the entire world, starting with America. Of course, this type of migration, it doesn't look anything like the migration that we have today. The second type of migration, though, it certainly does. We're talking about the peaceful mobilization of millions of people who seek to escape their territory of origin to reach another territory where they can find new and better opportunities. Therefore, in this case, their drive is to search for economic improvements and sometimes also to escape political and religious persecution. Therefore, in general, we're talking about peaceful migrations from the least developed countries to the most developed countries, which is something like the opposite of conquests. Well, the first large case happened at the end of the Middle Ages, when cities grew and people began to leave the countryside to move to these cities. In any case, it was a really slow process, but everything changed with the arrival of the Industrial Revolution. It's estimated that between 1850 and 1930, almost 60 million Europeans, which was a huge percentage of the population at that time, emigrated to the Americas to countries like the US, Canada, Brazil, and Argentina. That is to say, despite all the political discourse against immigration, the truth is that Europe has a well-defined history as an immigrant territory. Europeans first emigrated massively from the countryside to the cities, then they moved around the world, and now, in our times, millions and millions of Europeans have left their land to live in another European Union country. And what about the United States? Almost all of its population, if not all of it, comes from other countries or lives in territories that belong to other countries, as is the case of the lands of California, New Mexico, and Texas, which historically belonged to Mexico. So, in a way, we're all really the descendants of immigrants. In fact, if we take the current anti-immigration demonstrations to the extreme, we could state that we are all immigrants in the regions in which we live. Now, the question we must ask is, well, what are the consequences of all of that? Could it have something to do with the fact that most of the richest and most developed countries in the world have been exposed to the migratory process? Well, listen up.
What history tells us.
We'll say it loud and we'll say it clear. Most immigrants share a common goal: to achieve a better life and more progress. It's true, some people with deep pockets or a good standard of living move from their country to grow professionally, live new experiences, or maybe just live differently. These immigrants, who usually arrive with a full wallet, almost never awaken anyone's mistrust. However, the same does not apply to people who are escaping hunger, misery, all kinds of political, religious, and social persecutions. These are immigrants who arrive with an empty wallet in search of new opportunities. This type of immigration is by far the most important, and of course the one that generates the greatest mistrust, hostility, and criticism. However, this immigration is almost identical to our ancestors. We're talking about people who are risking their lives and who decided to leave everything behind, which is certainly not easy. And all for what? Well, the same as always: to achieve a better future, to work, and to prosper in a lawful way.
Little is more extraordinary than the decision to migrate, the accumulation of emotions and thoughts which finally leads a family to say farewell to a community where it has lived for centuries, to abandon old ties and familiar landmarks, and to sail across dark seas to a strange land. John F. Kennedy, President of the United States of America.
Tell me, who built America? Who promoted the extraordinary economic takeoff that Argentina saw at the end of the 19th century? Well, folks, it was the immigrants and the descendants of the immigrants. So why do we think of things as different today? But, of course, when economic data shows that immigration drives growth and development due to higher employment levels, entrepreneurship, and productivity, then anti-immigration critics, well, they make up other excuses. We're going to talk about them one by one in a future video with data in hand, but today I'd like to end this video with a reflection on one of the most important myths: fear and crime.
When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists.
One of the most widely spread myths is that immigrants, especially undocumented immigrants, the so-called illegals, are the ones responsible for most crimes and delinquency. Well, you know what? The data actually says that the opposite is true. Now, it is true that there are legal and illegal immigrants who commit crimes. However, let's look at an example. Let's look at what happens in the country with the most immigrants in the world, the United States. See, between 1990 and 2013, the number of undocumented immigrants, known as illegal immigrants, went from 3.5 million people to approximately 11 million. However, in that same period, according to the FBI, the number of violent crimes dropped by 48%. Surprised? Well, if we take the crime data into account, you really shouldn't be. See, according to an Immigration Policy Center study, only 1.6% of immigrant men aged 18 to 39 end up in prison. Among those born in the United States, the data is 3.3%, so more than double. Check out this graph on crime levels in Texas, which is one of the states with the most legal and illegal immigrants. Yes, we can agree that we need to reorder the migratory processes, but stigmatizing immigrants and outlawing their condition only favors the human trafficking mafias. The evidence is clear. Immigrants try to reach countries with higher levels of freedom and more open economic systems. In short, places where they can work and enjoy life without fear. Therefore, perhaps a good measure, and maybe the only one to control the migratory flow, is to promote trade, private investment, and democratic institutions in the countries that people are leaving. But meanwhile, developed countries can take advantage of immigration in the same way as other societies did throughout history. Immigrants, dear viewer, they want to work, and they want to prosper. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please do hit that like button if you did, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for brand new videos. Also, don't forget to check out our friends at Reconsider Media. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. And don't forget, as I said, this channel, it's all possible because of Patreon and our patrons on that platform. Please do consider joining them and supporting our mission of providing independent political coverage. And as always, thank you for watching.
The United States will not be a migrant camp, and it will not be a refugee holding facility. It won't be.